Welcome, everybody. My name is Whitney Otten. I teach here in the Div School, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Alain de Libéra of the Collège de France. And Professor de Libéra is our guest here at the university under the terms of an exchange program that the University of Chicago, I believe, is the only American university has with the Collège de France. So we're very pleased indeed that he is here. He's a well-known expert on medieval philosophy, and he's taught before at the University of Geneva. I was going to say Chicago. Chicago. Also on a lake.
The Swiss Chicago.
Yes, also the Swiss Chicago. And right now he is at the Collège de France, where he holds the chair formerly held by Etienne Gilson. He's not the immediate successor, but there was a gap in between until
50 years.
15 years until they got Professor de Libéra. So he's here because the medieval, or the Div School is a place where medieval studies is done excellently, as Professor McGinn can attest. But it's also interesting, Professor de Libéra told me that when you're appointed at the Collège de France, the president of the République signs for it. So he was officially inducted by François Hollande. So it should be une Hollandaise. I was actually quite proud of that little fact. But the fact that I'm Hollandaise is also responsible for quite a glaring mistake on the invitation and the poster. Because the text of, or the title of today's lecture, as you will have seen, is Will and Nil, Christ's Agony in the Garden and Other Ethical Dilemmas in Early Christian and Medieval Thought. But Professor de Libéra had spelled nil with two L's. That's how I forwarded it to the communication department, which told me, it should be with one L. I actually checked on my computer and I found one L. And since I'm Hollandaise and not a Native American, I just thought that I should go with that. But it should be nil with two L's, like in the Latin velle and nolle, willing and not willing. So I did not will to make mistakes, but I did not nil enough to avoid it, apparently. So it is really my mistake. But I hope it adds to the pleasure for all of you of hearing this wonderful lecture, for which there has been a handout distributed on Christ's will and nil, Christ's agony in the garden, and other ethical dilemmas in early Christian and medieval thought. Please join me in welcoming Professor de Libéra.
So, Mesdames, Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here, and I do thank Professor Otten for her kind invitation. I'm very pleased to be here, really. And, we'll need, as I said yesterday, much ado about nothing. The other part of the lecture will be something, I hope, Christ's agony in the garden and other ethical dilemmas in early Christian and medieval thought. So let me start with not François Hollande, but Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II's lament for the dead after the first year of the First World War. I did not want this. Before God and history, my conscience is clear. I did not will the war. Ich habe es nicht gewollt. This famous and perhaps forged sentence has had an impressive fortune in German, and which is more surprising in English literature, it is used by Karl Kraus in The Last Days of Mankind, whose last words are the voice of God. I did not want this. Why the apocalypse descends on the grotesque battlefield on which the Lord of Hyenas has led his pack in a waltz among the corpses, flames, thunder, and finally doom. It is also used by D.H. Lawrence in the first version of Women in Love, where Birkin echoes Kaiser's words as he absorbs himself in advance of any pain Ursula might feel in the future. And if we go wrong, I shall know, ich habe es nicht gewollt. There are many ways to deal with such a sentence. Roderick Chisholm, in Human Freedom and the Self, provides one very exciting from a medieval archaeological point of view. Chisholm is one of the few contemporary philosophers of the analytic tradition referring as a philosopher to medieval concepts or distinctions. This is item number 1 in your handout. Our relation to a mystic that we contemplate may not be a matter simply of our being able to bring it about or not to bring it about. As St. Johnston noted, there are at least 4 possibilities. We may illustrate them by reference to a public official and an event which is receiving a bribe in the following way. 1. He may be able to bring the event about himself, facere esse, in which case he would actively cause himself to receive the bribe. 2nd, he may be able to refrain from bringing it about himself, non facere esse, in which case he would not himself do anything to ensure that he received the bribe. 3rd, he may be able to do something to prevent the event from occurring, facere non esse, in which case he would make sure that the $10,000 was not left behind the garage or garage, or he may be unable to do anything to prevent the event from occurring, non facere non esse, in which case he may not solicit a bribe, he would allow himself to keep it. The situation is best summarized in those terms. A man who can resist the temptation to 1, but cannot resist the temptation to 4, that is, a man can refrain from bringing the event about himself, but cannot bring himself to do anything to prevent it. One word concerning the reference to Anselm, Saint Anselm. Chisholm is speaking of fragments discovered in a Landes Palace library manuscript 59, De potestate et impotentia, possibilitate et impossibilitate, necessitate et libertate, published in 1936 by Anselm's great editor Don François de Sales Schmidt, Franciscus Salesius Schmidt, under the title Landes Fragments. In those fragments, dealing with facere, doing, Anselm proposes a logical pattern of analysis that can be extended to willing and to combinations of willing and doing. Such combinations give rise to the square of doing, or making, or bringing about, articulating facere esse and facere non esse, non facere esse and non facere non esse. Item 3, quotation, Desmond Paul Henry, great book on Anselm, The Logic of Saint Anselm, 1967, is paraphrasing item 2, that is the Latin text. français. For all x, if x does is true, then x does so that something either is so or is not so. As the analysis of doing will in fact be an analysis of x's doing so that p, and of x's doing so that not p, where p is a clause describing a state of affairs, and not p is short for it is not the case that p. So this can be schematized in the square of doing, factor esse, 1, 2, factor non-esse, 3, non-factor non-esse, 4, non-factor esse. One may translate esse doing so that p in terms of causation, causality, to cause P to be, etc. To cause P to be should be understood as a shorthand for to do such that P is the case. If an agent X does such that P is the case, then it causes P to be, and vice versa. So this shorthand is listed. So finally, we've got 4 types of agency. Factor esse to cause to be, factor non-esse to cause not to be, non-factor non-esse not to cause not to be, and non-factor esse not to cause to be. The implication relationships between these 4 types of agency form a square of position that Sarah Uckerman calls agentive square of opposition, articulating the types according to relations of contrariety, contradiction, contrariety, and subordination. We've got the picture from this picture on item 5. The logical square. One of Anselm's most striking points is the attention paid to omission, non-factor. Another striking point is the possibility to extend the square of doing to willing in a square of willing. V, really, Vn, really non, NVN, not really non, and for NV, non really. And to extend it also to will to do in a square of willing to do, really, plus factor, that is item 7. With all these 3 squares, we've got the predicates necessary to build a theory of action, of will and action, that is a theory of freedom and will. But what are the subjects? The free subject is the subject of freedom. Who or what is this subject? This is a question of freedom, or better said, the questions of freedom, according to Chisholm, already posed and solved by John Locke, 1908. The question of freedom, as John Locke said, is not the question whether the will be free. It is the question whether a man be free. For if there is a will as a moving faculty, the question is whether the man is free to will to do those things that he does will to do, and also whether he's free not to will any of those things that he does will to do, and again whether he's free to will any of those things that he does not will to do. Let me pick out 2 points. First point, the question of freedom is about man's freedom, not about freedom of the will. Why? To answer this question, we have to refer to 2 basic Lockean principles, item 9 and 10 in the handout. Locke's principle 1, freedom belongs to that which has the power or not the power to operate. So freedom is about man's freedom, not about freedom of the will, because it is man who has the power to operate, not will, the will. LP2, powers are relations, not agents. Very important thesis. Because powers do not operate. For instance, according to John Locke, will doesn't operate on the understanding, and understanding doesn't operate on the will. It is the mind that is operating through will or understanding. It is man who is operating through the understanding or the will. Some people, for example, Simon Bishop, Simon Episcopius, a Dutch Arminist, said that the freedom of man could not be safeguarded if the faculties of the soul were real entities, because there would be as many distinct agents acting distinctly in us as faculties really distinct from another. Leibniz rejects this inference. Distinct powers can pass for real agents only in extravagant speech, he says. Locke is thus right in saying that it is not the faculties or qualities which act, but substances by means of the faculties. Some versions of the theory that I call two agents theory, TAT, are based on the assumption that powers are agents. Others merely sustain that there can be more than one agent in man. Against TAT, two-agent theory, one must assert the axiom: as many activities as many relations, and not as many activities as many agents. Second point I wanted to take up, of course, last three questions. Item 11, question 1, is man free to will to do those things that he does will to do? Is man free not to will any of those things that he does will to do? And question 3, is man free to will any of those things that he doesn't will to do? Chisholm argues against Edwards, Johnson Edwards. He writes, Johnson Edwards tried to restrict himself to the question, is a man free to do what it is that he wills? But the answer to this question will not tell us whether man is responsible for what it is that he does will to do. So Chisholm introduces, in order to be more clear, a medieval distinction, a distinction between actus imperatus and actus elicitus. It's item number 12. Using another pair of medieval terms, we may say, so he writes, that the metaphysical problem of freedom does not concern the actus imperatus. It doesn't concern the question whether we are free to accomplish whatever it is that we will or set out to do. It concerns the actus elicitus, the question whether we are free to will or to set out to do those things that we do will or set out to do. In order to be more clear, we should read the first version of the paper by Chisholm, the so-called Linley Lecture, 1964, published under the title Freedom in Action by Lehrer. There, Chisholm explains what is exactly the difference of actus imperatus and actus elicitus and the import of it for our present discussions. It is one thing, item number 13, to ask whether the things that a man wills are things that are within his power. This is a problem of the actus imperatus. It is quite a different thing to ask whether his willing itself is something that is within his power. This is the problem of actus elicitus. In this latter, the problem of the actus solicitus is a problem not of the freedom of the will, but of the freedom of the man. Now, Leibniz. Leibniz, it's item number 14. Leibniz on Hobbes versus Bramhall. Leibniz wrote a small essay called Reflections on the Work that Mr. Hawkes published in English on freedom, necessity, and chance. This is mistaken because precisely this book wasn't published by Hawkes, but by his disciple John Davis of Killarney, and Hawkes didn't know that. If he had, he would have been afraid because the book was dangerous for him. Anyway, in this book there's a preface by John Davis of Killarney that Leibniz has attributed to Hobbes himself. So it explains that he has made some sort of quaestio ad utramque partem, Leibniz, on the basis of Hobbes, of liberty and necessity, and Bramhall, Bishop of Derry, a vindication of true liberty. And so he gives his arbitrage between the two theses. Hawkes upholds four theses, and Leibniz picks up one, the first. It is not in the present power of man to choose for himself the will that he should have. Bramhall has five theses, but Leibniz picks up two of them for our present purpose. B1, man is free absolutely, not only to choose what he wills to do, but also to choose what he wills to will. And B3, the will can choose whether it wills to will or not. Leibniz, item 15, accepts H1, Hobbes, and rejects item 16 and 17, B1 and B3. And why? I jump to item 18, Leibniz temporal claim. This claim is the following. Of course, I've rewritten this claim. If I am willing at T, I cannot at T choose not to will, or to will otherwise than I will, or even merely to will what I will at T. To will is to have already chosen to will. In the end, so Locke's three questions are four. You must add to the first question, the fourth question. When? The temporal reference makes the difference. Hobbes holds that the received definition of a free agent is nonsense and contradictory. What is this received definition of a free agent? The following: a free agent is that which, when all things are present that are needful to produce the effect, can nevertheless not produce it. And Bramhall's answer to Hobbes' criticism is based on the power everyone has to forbear willing what it does will, or second claim, to will what it doesn't will. The key word is forbear. See Marlowe's drama, The Troublesome Reign and Lamentable Death of Edward II, King of England, with the tragical fall of Count Mortimer, King Edward's to lifelong professional killer coming to kill him. This looks of thine can harbor not but death, I see my tragedy written in thy rose. Yet stay a while, forbear thy bloody hands. And let me see the stroke before it comes, that even then, when I shall lose my life, my mind may be more steadfast on my God. So the subject of this lecture should thus be will with 2L, nil with 2L, and forbear with no L. So will, nil, forbear. In French, vouloir, nouloir, nouloir. Différer, or forbear. Respond to welle, nolle, non welle, the and the in the Amsterdam square of opposition. Forbear means not will that be, and the refrain one's own will. It doesn't mean will that not be, the end. Will that not be is nil. So, the medieval dilemmas, item number 21. Could I will at tea what I kneel at tea? Could I kneel at tea what I will at tea? Could I forbear at tea what I will at tea or kneel at tea? This point is crucial. According to a 15th century German champion of Pyrrhonism, Jodokus Trutvetter, died 1950 would be a great champion. Not that kind of champion, the 1519. One of, anyway, he was a champion because he was Martin Luther's master of logic in Erfurt. According to Trutvetter, it is commonly taught at the end of the 15th century that the will is free with regard to contradictory alternatives, but not with regard to contrary alternatives. Item 22. Communitas communiter dicitur voluntatem esse liberam in actibus contradictoriis, quales sunt velle non velle, nolle non nolle, se non contrariis, ut puta is velle nolle acceptare refutare. Now that's interesting, this difference between contraries and contradictories. Of course, there is a difference from a logical point of view between statements, contrary statements and contradictories. Item 23. Willing and kneeling cannot be true simultaneously because they are contraries, and contrary statements cannot be true simultaneously. So they cannot exist at the same time in the same person. But they can be false simultaneously. When? How? Simply in the case of non-willing. In the case of an absence of willing. The and the n, velle and velle non, can be false at the same time in case that non-velle is true. If non-velle is true, there is no velle whatsoever. Thus neither the nor the n. Willing and non-willing, kneeling and non-kneeling are contradictories. They cannot be false simultaneously. Either the former is true and the latter false, or the latter is true and the former is false. But one, me, is always free to suspend any act of willing. And kneeling, VM, is an act of willing. A negative one. An act of willing whose object is a negative fact or state of affairs. The founding principles, item 24, of freedom lie on the possibility that one has to choose, in the end, between willing acceptance and not willing, that is, postponing volition, or, as another Herfordian Perenninist, Bartholomeus Arnoldi, usually called Usingen, says, the possibility the will has to freely suspend itself, suspendere actum suum, instead of, rather than, assentire consent. Why suspendere actum suum? Two reasons, according to Arnoldi Usingen. Either in order to deliberate and inquire more about the goodness of an appearing good, or in order to experience its freedom, the beautiful, I find. The distinction between velle, nolle, and non-velle can be expressed by that of assensus, dissensus, and ascensionis retentio. As such, it is thus part of the history of epoche, ascensionis retentio. There is no freedom of consenting without the freedom of not willing, the freedom of non-velle, the ascensionis retentio. In item number 25, you will find a comment of Rino Saarinen, weakness of will in Renaissance and Reformation thought. I quote the last sentence: the freedom of consenting to one alternative basically means either willing it or lacking this will. This is the basis of freedom. The impossibility of simultaneously will and nil the same thing is crucial in the archaeology of subject. To weigh its importance, one should look at Luis de Molina's question. It is a beautiful title, Utrum voluntas in quo temporis puncto aliquid vult libera sit ad illum idem non volendum nolendum ve, but e contrario. Well, it's a very important question because it sums up all the problems and concepts implied. Molina discusses Ockham, Gabriel Biel, and the other nominalist doctors who sustain, in modern terms, that at the instant T in which the will elicits a volition, V, the will is not any more free not to elicit it, not NV, or to elicit the volition, the M. And conversely, that at the instant T in which the will elicits a volition, the will is not any more free to will the corresponding volition. Item number 27, Professor Clark concerning Ockham. Ockham divides the process of causing freely into three moments: before, during, and after, and claims this division is germane to both divine and human liberty. He writes, before a definite volition is elicited, the will's posture is undetermined to either produce or not produce that volition. At the moment of choice, the will is self-determined, incapable of producing the contrary act simultaneously. Then, after eliciting the act, the will regains its indifference to continue or change its decision. So, as you see, the synchronicity of will and nil is a major philosophical problem in medieval philosophy. It consists of the following questions. Item number 28. can I at T will that P and nil that P? If I will P at T, am I still free at T to nil P? If I nil P at T, am I still free at T to will P? If I will P at T, am I still free to nil P at T? If I nil P at T, am I still free to will P at T? The question is not at T minus 1, when I could still change my mind with respect to doing P at T. Not willing to do it if I was about to do it, willing to do it if I was about not to do it. The question is to be still free at T to nil P while willing that P and doing that P, or to will P while nilling P and doing that not P. This question is linked to Harry Frankfurt's principle of alternate possibilities, PAP. A person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. And its revised version, PAP, which allows compatibility of moral responsibility and determinism. A person is not morally responsible for what she has done if she did it only because she couldn't have done otherwise. I revise the revised version for having a feminine person instead of a masculine person. So, PAP, principle of alternate possibility, is by far not the only principle that plays a role in the archaeology of will and action. One can mention, of course, four other principles. The first one is the Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction, PNC. The same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect. Second, the theological principle of limitation of divine omnipotence. That is, God can do whatever, doesn't imply a contradiction. Third, the Aristotelian principle of conditional necessity. What is necessarily is when it is, and what is not necessarily is not when it is not. It is the interpretation is the basis of the famous that I have tomorrow. Finally, fourth, Lovejoy's principle of plenitude. No genuine possibility can remain forever unrealized. With those four principles, you've got everything you need to follow me to the garden. And first, to the Scottish Revolution. What is the Scottish Revolution? Item 31. First, a new theory of contingency based on synchronicity of alternate possibilities. That is, a synchronic concept of contingency instead of a diachronic concept of contingency. Second, a new concept of the contingent. Contingent is not a mode of being. It's a non-necessary or non-sempiternal based on the statistic definition of contingency. But it's now considered as a mode of action, subordinate to will, a state of affair whose contrary could still happen while it is happening. Cuius oppositum posset fieri quando istu fit. Item 31. Dico quod non voco et contingens quodcunque non necessarium vel non sempiternum, sed cuius oppositum posset fieri quando illut fit. ideo dixi aliquid contingenter causatur et non aliquid est contingent. This is a revolution, really. In contemporary, that is our time, modal logic, one uses the term contingent to designate a possible state of affairs, the opposite of which is also possible for the same moment. So understood, contingent refers to the level of possibility as described by Scotus as possibilitas logica. Scotus' concept of contingence has an extra element. According to him, contingence designates a factual state of affair, the opposite of which is possible at the same time. So not a possible state of affair, whose opposite is possible at the same time, but a factual state of affair, whose opposite is still possible at the same time. So that the great revolution is Scotus' formula, 1832. Few words for a big revolution. Volens in a, potest noli in a. Where in a or in a means the same as our 1832. Scotus' revolutionary claim, 1833, is the difference between temporal priority and the idea of natural priority. And at that moment at which it elicits an act of willing, the will is prior by nature in regard to its volition, and it's freely related to it. Hence, it is contingently related to willing, and as a contingent relation to not willing at that moment at which it elicits a volition. This is not because it had a contingent relation to willing at an earlier moment, that is at t-1. For then it was not a cause. But because now, when it is a cause which elicits an act of willing, the will has a contingent relation to the act, so that willing at A, it can live at A. Now, Christ's agony and in the garden, and the problem of Gethsemane. My object now is what I call the problem of Gethsemane. By problem, I understand what Collingwood calls a complex consisting of questions and answers, not a perennial supra-temporal problem, eternal problem or quasi-eternal problem, but a complex consisting of questions and answers. The question of Christ's two wills pertains to the problem of Gethsemane. The problem of Gethsemane is part of what I call the Christological term of anthropology. It plays an important role in the archaeology of the subject. It can be considered as a case study and as an introduction to the lecture on philosophical archaeology and deconstruction of next April 26th. The problem is posed by Jesus' prayer in the garden and his so-called denial of the cup. Luke 22:42. Father, if thou would be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Matthew 26:39. Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And finally, Mark 14:36. Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but thou wilt. the prayer with two parts, two quite opposing parts. The question developed through several forms in the history of Christological debate. The Arians used Jesus' prayer as evidence that the Logos was not of the same substance as the Father, and Rose and Augustine responded by distinguishing the human will from the will of divinity in Christ. I will here focus on some aspects of the 7th century debate on the number of wills in Christ, known as the monocelite controversy. Monocelitism emerged as an alternative to the controversial proposal of mia energia, one energy, one action, one operation in Christ. In 633, Emperor Heraclius promulgated the Alexandrian Pact of Union to promote reconciliation between Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians. Heraclius sought religious unity between the Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians to consolidate political power in what were very difficult times for the Byzantine Empire. There was famous military defeat of the Yarmouk against the Arabs. Sergius, Patriarch of Constantinople, initially supported the Alexandrian Pact of Union. After its rejection by Sophronius, elder monk and Patriarch of Jerusalem, Sergius suspended his support. Sergius Psephos, his synodal letter to Pope Honorius in 634 advised silence regarding one or two energies in Christ, lest two opposing wills be expressed. Pope Honorius' enthusiastic reply denied opposing wills in Christ by affirming en telema, one will. Sergius used the expression en telema in his Ectesias 638, which Heraclius promulgated to end debates about one or two energies in Christ. Of course, the Ectesias did not end the debate. Debate continued long after Constance II ascended to the throne in 641. Constance II issued the so-called Typos in 647, withdrawing the Ectesias and preparing the way for the Lateran Council of 649, which issued its findings in canons in both Greek and Latin. The most prominent defender of the duocelite two-wills Christology was Maximus, Confessor. Maximus' efforts to defend Chalcedonian orthodoxy before, during, and after the Lateran Council of 649 led to his trials, as you know, mutilation and exile. After suffering the removal of his tongue and right hand, Maximus was exiled to Lazica, where he died in 662. But in the end, like the German in football, he won. It's the sixth ecumenical council, Constantinople III, was convened on 7th November 680, but its final decision was to confirm in 681 two non-contrary natural wills and operations in Christ. So the next important figure in history of debate on Christ's two wills is John of Damascus, whose exposition of the Orthodox faith introduced in the West by Peter Lombard in books of sentences after Buconius. Kinzer's translation is as well one of the major sources of Latin medieval theology. 1836, let us briefly consider the Psephos. The issue is the number of energies, activities, or operations in Christ. Sergius has a solution to bring peace, to forbid all mention of number. But obviously, he doesn't consider the doctrines of one energy and two energies of equal value, since on the one hand he forbids reference to one energy, not because the one energy doctrine is erroneous, but merely because some people think that it implies or seems to imply the denial of Christ's two natures. On the other hand, he forbids reference to the doctrine of two energies because it does entail the existence of two wills opposing and antios one another. As if God, the Logos, willed to endure the passion and his humanity opposed his will. Literally, as if one will, that of God the Verb, willed the passion, while another will, that of the humanity in him, resisted in Antimenes the former, which would introduce, so he says, two willers, willing, opposing things, duo tus tanantia tenontas, which is impious. Impious, why? Because impossible. And impossible, why? Because transgressing PNC, principle of non-contradiction, or more precisely, an application of PNC that I call principle of subjective consistence of the will. I quote Sergius, which is impious because it is impossible that for one and the same subject, any kaito auto upukaimeno, two contrary wills, duo telemata, subsist at the same time in the same respect. Hana kai katatoton. This mention often upukaimenon as subject of wills is the first step in direction of the idea of a willing subject. It still belongs to what Heidegger called Subjektivität, subjecticity, a physical scheme, but it already points towards subjectivity, Subjektivität, that is towards our modern post-Kantian psychical pattern of the mental. What is said by Sergius is that there cannot be two wills in the same subject, because there cannot be two willers willing of contraries in the same subject. That is, item 37, it is impossible that for one and the same subject, two contrary wills subsist at the same time in the same respect. In his book, the Byzantine Christ, Bathros, translates, item 38, it is impossible that one and the same person has two wills which contradict each other. Of course, this is not false as a translation, but it is a modern, personal interpretation of the genuine principle, obviously linked to PNC, principle of contradiction. Sergius has not discovered the principle of subjective consistence of the will. Already Apollinaris of Laodicea died 390, who was a bishop of Laodicea, today Latakia or Latakia in Syria, rejected the two wills, because if every intellect rules over his own will, which is his doctrine, Then, he says, it is impossible for two willers willing things opposite to one another to coexist in one and the same subject. For each one will do what is desirable to it according to a self-moved impulse. Cat hormen autokineton. The connection between the principle of subjective coherence and the will and PNC, principle of non-contradiction, is not the only possible philosophical reference. Another could be Plato's principle of non-opposition, PNO, formulated in the Republic, 1939. In the Republic, Plato first states PNO with the verbs poiein and pascein. Right? It is clear that the same thing will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same respect and in relation to the same thing at the same time. Before it divides reason from appetite, Socrates in the Republic offers a second specification of the general principle of non-opposition with the verb pratein, to achieve, to bring about, to effect, to accomplish. And this is the second quotation. Therefore, if sometime something draws the soul back when it is thirsting, wouldn't that be something in it that differs from the thing that thirsts and drives it like a beast to drink? For as we said, the same thing would not do opposites by the same thing of itself, to auto L2, about the same thing, perito auto, at the same time. What is interesting here is, again, the absence of the word kaina, which is definitely an Aristotelian word, required by PNC. What is interesting here, is the presence of the word erutum, a word that plays a pivotal role in Foucault's interpretation of the Alcibiades care of the self in the hermeneutics, hermeneutics of the subject. In French, hermeneutique, which is easier, huh? And this, what's interesting, finally, is this expression by the same thing of itself, to auto L2, which seems tailored for the cases of psychological conflict within the soul, conflict in one's self. I will revert on this Elton and on the subject on April the 26th. This being said, Christ's denial of the cup and prayer of agony, viewed by Sergius and his Greek opponents, from Maximus Confessor onwards up to Latin scholastics, on the basis of PNC and the principle of subjective consistence of the will, with their ontological approach of the conflict of wills existing or not in Christ, this is not, by no means, the only possible interpretation of the conflict. It is based on an Aristotelian scheme that has at least one formidable competitor, the Augustinian one, repeatedly connected to Paulinian anthropology, from Augustine himself onwards up to contemporary philosophy. Just to remind you of what you know, Paul's ethical dilemma, 1940, in struggling with sin, Paul's VF, vole facere, I do, is dissociated, and carnal, soul under sin. for that which I do, I alone not for what I would. That do I not, but what I hate, that do I. Galatians, for the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. I quote Latin, caro enim concupiscit adversus spiritum, spiritus autem adversus carnem, haec enim invicem adversantur, ut non quaecumque multis illa faciatis. And the idea that there are two men in me, and the idea that there are two laws in me, as in Paul, the law of God, the law of sin, and the idea that there are two agents in me, as in Episcopius, Bishop's argument against the real distinction of mental faculties, and the idea, as in Sergius' argument against the two energies in Christ, that there are two willers in me, and the idea of the divided self. In the recollections of my youth, Ernest Renan writes beautifully, I am double, as it were, and one half of me laughs while the other weeps. This is the explanation of my cheerfulness. As I am two spirits in one body, one of them has always cause to be content. To be, and not to be, and be not, would I say. 1841, the non-Aristotelian paradigm, the Augustinian one, is best exposed by Hannah Arendt. In The Life of the Mind, the author's final work, a rich, challenging analysis of man's mental activity, considered in terms of thinking, willing, and judging, edited after her death by Mary McCarthy. There are a number of Arendt theorems. The Arendt theorems are that, first one, that 1842, that every I will is inevitably countered by an I nil. The will always addresses to itself. When the command says, thou shalt, the will replies, thou shalt will, as the command says, and not mindlessly execute on earth. That, according to Hannah Arendt, that is the moment when the internal contest begins for the aroused counter-will as a like power of command. Hence, the reason all who rely on works of the law are under a curse is not only the I will and cannot, but not partial, but also the fact that the I will inevitably is countered by an I nil, so that even if the law is obeyed and fulfilled, there remains this inner resistance. Freedom is the power of to say, the power to say yes or no. Freedom is the power to say no, according to Louis Pratt, the philosopher who introduced the word volonté in philosophical French. Freedom, he wrote, is essentially volonté, that is kneeling or nil. This is written in a book whose title is Le caractère empirique et la personne du rôle de la volonté en psychologie et en morale. It was written at the beginning of the 20th century. another Arendt's theorem, number 43. A no is implied in every yes. Arendt, if the will did not have the choice of saying no, it would no longer be a will. And if there were not a counter will within me that is aroused by the very commandment of the thou shalt, if to speak in Paul's terms, sin did not dwell within me, I would not need a will at all. Knowledge is no less actively transitive than very, no less a faculty of will. If I will what I do not desire, I nil my desires, and in the same way, I can nil what reason tells me is right. In every act of the will, there is an I will and I nil involved. These are the two wills whose discord, Augustine said, and did is soul. The fundamental reference is Augustine's monstrosity argument in the Confessions. Whence is this monstrosity, and why is it? The mind commands the body and is obeyed immediately. The mind commands itself and is resisted. In scholastic terms, actus imperatus is not problematic. Actus elicitus is problematic. Why? Because the will commanding that there be a will, I will to do so and so, is not another will, as would be the case if the mind were divided between conflicting wills and willers, as in Sergius' hypothesis, but as Augustine writes, the same will itself, an expression that reminds me of Plato's to auto L2, the same thing of itself. The split occurs in the will itself. The conflict arises neither out of a split between mind and will, nor out of a split between flesh and mind. There is an Augustinian pattern, an Augustinian scheme based on the very knowledge split. What I call the Scotistic revolution is closely related to this Augustinian scheme. Volens in hoc, potens knowledge in hoc. It is in the will's nature to double itself. You always need two antagonist wills to will at all. It is not monstrous partly to will and partly to nil. Non igitur monstrum partem velle, partem nolo, says Augustine. The trouble. But this trouble is what makes a human being human. The trouble is that it is the same willing ego that simultaneously wills and nils. Item 50. Myself, when I was deliberating upon serving the Lord my God now, as I had long purposed, it was I who will, who nils, I who will, who nil. I myself, I'm neither willed entirely, nor nilled entirely, therefore was I at strife with myself and rent asunder by myself. Ego eram quivoribam, ego eram, nec plene voribam, nec plene noeram, ideo mecum contendebam et dissipabam a me ipso. And this does not mean that I was of two minds, one good, the other evil. And this ran befell me against my will, and yet indicated not the presence of another man, but the punishment of my own. Et ipsa dissipatio meo invito quidem fiedam, nec tamen ostendebat naturam mentis aliene, sed penam me. I cannot will that P using the whole of my will, because my will is two wills, a will and a counter will, neither of which is entire. A good will being no less split than a bad one, vice versa. According to Pope Benedict XVI, in the drama of Jesus' agony, of the anguish of death, of the opposition between the human will not to die and the divine will, which offers itself to death, in the drama of Gethsemane, the whole human drama is played out. What is this drama? The will is never entire. It is divided against itself. A will that would be entire without a counter will could no longer be a will, properly speaking. It is a fallacy to count so many contrary natures as there are conflicting wills, so many agents, so many willers. So, I conclude. The three questions of Locke may all be positively answered. Is man free to will to do those things that he doesn't will to do? Yes. Is man free not to will any of those things that he does will to do? Yes. Is man free to will any of those things that he doesn't will to do? Yes. And the fourth question, when? Any time. Before and while doing. If it were done when it is done, then farewell, says Macbeth. Well or not, it is actually. The moment man stops doing, he loses his freedom. No one can undo the past. One can only say, Ich habe es nicht gewollt, because it is always partly true. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture and a tour d'horizon from Kaiser II to the agony in the garden and Maximus. I think it was very rich but also very clear narrative throughout. And I'm sure if you're willing, that there will be questions for you.
No hands for hands.
So please can I invite you to ask the question? Yes, Christine.
I have a question.
Sure.
And
Sorry.
because sorry. It might be just that I didn't understand something, but so it seems like this argument could support the mono-elitism, the idea that Christ has only one will, and that in that one will you have both you have those two sort of contrary dispositions. So I guess I'm wondering, in the garden, can you still maintain a sort of Chalcedonian logic of the two wills? And then would the human will have two contradictory wills, and then the divine will having two contradictory wills, and then wouldn't they cancel each other out?
Sergius first, to start with. He wants to avoid the idea of two contradictory wills, so the human and the divine. Contradictory will, in terms of wills of nature, that is, a will responding to the human nature and a will responding to the divine nature. So to avoid this contradiction between two wills, which would imply the contradiction between two willers and one subject, he has to say there is only one will in Christ. Which will? The divine. So in Christ there's only one will, the will of the passion. So how could you explain the first part of the prayer, that is the so-called denial of the cup, by a movement of passion, of senses, which will be characterized later on by scholastics as sin, le péché de sensualité, the sin of sensuality. Because the will is not implied in that conflict. There's a conflict between what the ancients, for instance, the Stoic philosophy, what was called prepatio, propateia. It's not passion properly, it's propateia in Greek. So it's not at the same level. So it's something that cannot be avoided. I mean, if I say, wow, you have a reaction, not possibly, so to say, physical, immediate, which implies only the perception, sensual perception, perceptual senses, reaction of central faculties. It's not the same level. So Christ doesn't experience really a conflict of will. So there's no conflict of will. There's a movement of the body, of the sensuality, that is opposed to the will, but which is, of course, without any power on the divine will in Christ. So in the end, there's no problem. He solves the problem of Gethsemane in a very traditional way, because he poses a question very interesting of the logical conflict between two wills. But in the end, he says there are not two wills. There's a prepatio, propateia, and there is a will. Telema. No problem. You see, so of course Maximus Confessor answered that it doesn't work. You pose a problem of conflict with will. So let's carry on with two wills. So there is a human will resisting to passion, not only a movement of Caro or the sax of the chair of the flesh. Yeah. So the word share is very dangerous. A movement of the chair. Well, the freshman and the chapter. I don't know what it is, but anyway, you see, Maximus says, let's start the whole thing again with two wills, and he has this beautiful theory that Christ has will with his human will. What is divine will? Well, he has will humanly, if I may speak so. What he will divinely. And so you are facing really the contradiction if you keep on with two wills, otherwise not. The solution is to say in the end there's only one will, because of the unity of the hypostasis, the human will can be subordinated to the divine will, and they can be combined in unity, in the unity of the hypostasis of the suppositum of the subject. And that's very interesting from an anthropological point of view. When I say that the Christological term of anthropology is what I'm interested in, I mean that precisely, and only that the hypostatic union is a model not only for the problem of two wills in Christ, but also for the unity, the union of soul and body in man. There's a hypostatic union of those and which is quite different from physical or whatsoever type of union. And this type of union is what Leibniz called the metaphysical union, the physical union. It has to do with enosis hypostatic, subjective, and sense that is not that of subjection. This thing that has physical properties is a substrate of qualities or disposition of properties. And if I have
further questions?
Yes,
You started us with thinking about doing, and then we moved to willing, and then in the last quotation we go back to doing. And it occurs to me that conflict that Augustine describes between willing and not willing is internal, and the doing is you can't do and not do.
That's something Augustine says. That is, of course, you can't do two things contrary at the same time. That is, for instance, speaking, not speaking. And you can, of course, think that you're saying something and right there you don't say anything because what you say is it's nothing, you know. But I don't want to play with the word. It's clear that doing things, that the coexistence of two contradictory or contrary actions, activities, physical, external, extramental activities is something that should be regarded as impossible. So I'm perfectly okay with that. Only that, but without any reference to what is our present purpose, that is doing, etc. But there has been some kind of reflection in the Middle Ages regarding the possibility of the existence of contradictory states in nature. That is, for instance, transubstantiation poses a problem of that kind. There's an instant at which, an instant T, where it is true to say for the first time, this is Christi, and perhaps true for last time, this is bread. You know, but well, I don't want to connect everything to everything. But
what I wonder is, if you're willing and not will, you can will and not will at the same time. But since you can't do and not do at the same time, can you say that which you do they ever worry about that moment between once you will to do, you collapse that possibility of contradiction? Can you actually say that you've willed something that you then don't do? And I think when Christ says, the command says, do this, and the first person says no, but then doesn't, and the second person says yes, but then doesn't. Which one did the will of my Father? It's the one who said no, but did.
Well, I see something like a button you turn, you know, and the intensity is variating. There's always no and yes and no, but so it means that there is no. Is there an instant, properly speaking, decisive, or is it a continuum? Is it a process where you never can say, well, he was still willing to do that when he decided to do the opposite? Is it possible? You must, in a way, be able to to say that in an instant T, as Scott say, you are both willing and needing. So, what does that mean? Scott is to make his claim understandable, says, is this kind of doing philosophy with that analytic philosophy you love today, because it's a thought experiment in a way. Given that there is only one instant, you will, and you can't will. In one instant, it's possible. If there is only one instant, you have not the possibility to have changed your mind. But obviously, if it's not possible to will at the instant T when it says not willing, and not willing at the instant T when there's willing, if it's not possible, then it will never be possible. What's not possible at every moment of time is impossible. You could argue against that during nights and days, but he does so. Suppose there's only one instant, and because for God it's the same thing. When God creates the world, it is in one instant. So what's possible, what's impossible, what is that He will to do, and what He doesn't will to do, and to coexist at this instant. So he argues that it's using the expression that is a class expression of that it's germane to find human reduced at an instant. But it is very linked to paradoxes of the continuum and decision. Paradox de décision. So anyway, thank you. It's not the last word, I'm afraid.
I see 3 more questions. Is that Sean and Michael and Adrian, right? So, Sean, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on this theme of the instant. Generally speaking, I'm interested in whether you see any connection between Augustine's doctrine of the will in Confessions 8 and his account of time in Confessions 11. More specifically, it seemed to me that a lot of these other theories of the will that you addressed presuppose a punctum temporis. They presuppose an at time t. Yeah. Whereas Augustine questions the idea of a punctum temporis in Confessions 11, so that he can make some room for describing temporal experience as distentio animi, which might seem to write forbearance or the different into temporal experience in a way that it's not for the other people. So I'm just curious if you have any.
No, I agree with you. One has to connect with both. And if you look at some works by the young Heidegger, when he was young, before saying that, when he was working on the phenomenology of the religious experience, you find his views on Augustine more or less on the way that you are indicating. Not that level, but it's more or less what you suggest. And I think that's the right way to get it. Because distentio animi is really another pattern for all that. Sorry, you're right in saying that punctum is very important. And that's a reason why, for instance, when I spoke from after transubstantiation, and so on. The whole argument is often characterized by the medieval logicism as a fallacia puncti. It's a sophism based on punctum, which dividing two continuum is part of both at the end of one and the beginning of the other. So, it can't be divided, but it pertains to two continuums. And what is such? The soul. The soul can be the strange punct that can be descended, something that can be contracted to extension. Contraction. Thank you. I'm a bit contracted, sorry.
First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. It seemed that absent from the whole discourse, or we didn't have an appearance of Thomas on the scene, where the resolution to this sort of two-will problem is the sort of play of the general will and the particular will that allows for the instance of will I will or not will in any particular instance. And yet it's that choosing of a particular will that goes against this general will, or the general resolution to the good. And it seems, at least one of the virtues of Aquinas' approach, is it does open up a much broader space for thinking about how the particular will is informed at any point by what's presented to the will through the body, through bodily senses, and through what the intellect presents at a particular moment. So it might give us, it may not give us this will in conflict, but it gives a much more embodied, willing subject, at least than what we might be presented through Augustine.
Certainly. But I couldn't.
Of course, you couldn't get it all in. It was just sort of
too long. But okay, that's true. But I think there are also other, not perhaps theories, but interesting, exciting problems in Averroism or Buridan. For Buridan, it's very obvious that Tortvetter and Usinger have used an incredible material to state what I consider a theory that stands on firm ground, what is said on contrariety and contradiction. But well, you have to look at cases, case studies in those philosophers. And I've looked at, for instance, adultery in Buridan and Averroism. Averroism is very interesting because they all use this V, VN, and V. And Averroism says, well, someone who is looking for some relationship, sexual relationship with a married woman, he wills it, and at the same moment he wants that not what to be married. So there's not a conflict of will. If will something, and he would prefer that the object of his desire would be in a different condition. But he says also, but for some men it's different. They will something, they would never will not accept the women be not married, because they look for married women they receive some prestige of the social condition of the husband. So that is one way of doing philosophy with some examples of that kind. And it's very interesting to follow the argument in all the philosophers, including Derrida, who has a very logical theory, and he's an expert, you know, François Villon, and the Tour de Nesle, and he's supposed to have been the lover of the Queen, but I let that apart. Another thing, Derrida says, well, what is desire? What is will? What is action? And he says, well, we have to construct a logica moralis, because he says, well, the way we do and will and act and react is based on antimony. Antimony? Antimony. So that is, instead of having two premises and one conclusion, drinking is pleasant, I'm thirsty, I drink. So two premises and one conclusion. There is only one premise, and I won't drink that, I can drink. But the sub-intellect, the other premise, the missing other premise, is the desire itself. So the desire takes the place of a mental representation and performs as a mental representation, a premise, and the action is anti-magnetic. So it would be do not waste time. Just do it. Yes. You know. So you see, all that sort of things is also present in the background. And Thomas Aquinas discusses also cases of that type. So I suggest, I agree with the fact that he has a more elaborated theory for the problem of Gethsemane. But for the other problems of the conflicting wills in man, the conflicting desires in man, and the conflicting desires and wills in man, so Abelard or Derrida or others are also very interesting. So I suggest always to look at those others. The idea of a logica moralis is very interesting. This is a logic of a rhetoric of desire and action. It's interesting because it's also based on the reception of the rhetoric. And there are few people in the Middle Ages that would have commented on the rhetoric. Jean Jardin, Louis-Daniste, but few. So
I think the final question, maybe Adrian.
Yeah.
First, yeah.
I can pass it. It's too late.
Can you handle one more question?
Is it about coffee, hot drinks? I know well the part of being that you are.
Would your account be slightly modified if you, like, for example, related more the question of will to the question of desire and ultimately the question of love, as Augustine does, right? He redirects the question of will to the question of desire. So would your account be, or your perspective be slightly...
No, I would develop what I said, but I wouldn't change the perspective because I think that there is there's a yes in every no and a no in every yes. So I think, as I haven't said, I need in every I will. So in desire, I suppose you may find the same. Exactly the same. And in the conflict between desire and will, you will find the same. So I say the same. 2 minutes ago. So I would look in Augustine answers for this kind of problems, and I'm sure, I'm pretty confident I would find more exciting answers than those of Gordon, and perhaps not Averroism. And Averroism, But the problem is will not to will. I mean, it's another problem. We didn't mention it. That's fine. Because that's another question. There's willing not that, but willing not to will. How can you say that you will not to will? It's like Kant. I must seem to forget my ballet. I must seem to forget. Don't forget to forget.
Thank you. I think there's still probably some coffee or cookies if you want to take them. Also, Professor Libéra is available for office hours on Thursday afternoon, and if you're interested, you can sign up. And there will be a follow-up lecture next Tuesday, as he already announced. That will be actually upstairs in the lecture hall. We'll also have coffee and tea at 4, start at 4:30. And there will be responses by Professor Coyne and Marino after that lecture. So thank you very much.
No, thank you to all.
Looking forward to more.
Pleasure, really.